Today I want to address a potentially problematic narrative that has been probably the most prevalent evangelical view of the God the Father's response to Jesus while Jesus hung on the cross. Basically, the view goes, with Jesus becoming sin, he was separated from God during his sacrifice. God's purity would not allow him to stay in connection with his Son during this moment. Many have been taught that God turned his back on him at this crucial time. Scriptural proof text for this postulate includes one of Jesus' 7 utterances while he hung on the cross, when he cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," or my God, why have you forsaken me?" To understand the power of sin and separation, Isaiah 59, 1 through 2 often is cited as the prophet states, "Surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear. But your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear." Getting back to the cross narrative just mentioned, how might it be problematic? Here, this view presents a father who abandons his son in the most trying time of his life. Earlier in another YouTube presentation, I presented Abraham's emotional and relational connection with Isaac as they walked up Mount Moriah prior to the impending sacrifice. Here in Genesis 22, we saw that the Hebrew text centered on one phrase spoken by Abraham once Isaac understood that he possibly would be the sacrifice. Simply, Abraham responds to him by saying, "Here I am." In essence, Abraham was saying, I'm with you. We as Christians, we can be very quick to draw parallels to the Akedah, or what's called the binding of Isaac, to the sacrifice of Christ on Gethsemane. However, this father-son connection between Abraham and Isaac is often overlooked because it really doesn't fit the paradigm of a God who distanced himself from his son while his son hung on the cross. So let's examine the possible parallel of this Abraham-Isaac moment of connection at Mount Moriah with the Father, or God, and the Son, Jesus, connection at the foot of the cross. Is there a similarity? But first, we need to explore the Isaiah 59 passage briefly, which frames really the evangelical view of God turning from Jesus at his death. In Isaiah, at first glance, we see that sin absolutely causes separation. This is quite obvious in our own relationships. If Michaela, my wife, by the way, and I have sinned against each other, which happens, there is going to be a breakdown in our communication and relationship until that issue is resolved. Sin does cause separation. This passage in Isaiah identifies the causative agent, though, or person responsible for this separation. Here we see that it is, and spoiler alert, man who sins that creates this divide. On the contrary, God's behavior in the moment of human depravity is to become really an agent of reconciliation, where we see later in the chapter in Isaiah that he initiates the saving solution by alluding to the coming Redeemer. If you look at verses 15 and 16, it reads, "The Lord looked and was displeased that there was no justice. He saw that there was no one. He was appalled that there was no one to intervene. So his own arm achieved salvation for him." So often this verse can influence our view of God and his reaction to us over sin. His reaction is not to turn away and be appalled of us, but to seek connection. I bring this proof text up first because it drives us really to a bias of the cry of Christ that was on the cross, that cry of separation, a cry of his Father turning away from him at this one moment. So to summarize, Isaiah 59 does talk about separation, really, but the acting agent, the one who causes this distance, is not God, but it's us. Psalm 22, the psalm that begins with a cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is known as an imprecatory psalm, or a psalm of lament. An imprecatory psalm is one that starts with radical openness towards God, yet eventually ends with praise and adulation. The openness of the psalmist in his expression of doubt, anger, and disappointment is astounding and can make us uncomfortable in looking to imitate this type of transparency with God, really in our own personal relationship. Psalm 22, then it is as it is today, is a psalm that the Jews would lean into in times of incredible challenge, of questions as to where their Redeemer was in the midst of their suffering and pain. Patrick Miller, in his book Interpreting the Psalms, examines this ebb and flow, or tension, if you may, between the psalmist as he shifts between complaint to expressions of trust, and as he states better than I can, moves from utter hopelessness to the conviction that God has heard and responded to the anguished cries of this human sufferer. So was Jesus' cry of being forsaken the end of the story? Or could it have been a voice of one engaging in the visceral moment of experiencing intense suffering who, like us, like the psalmist, feels isolated from God, wondering where he might be during this ordeal? Nearly 3.5 years ago, just prior to the COVID lockdown, our family lost our daughter-in-law Emily to cancer. She was just 26 years old. I remember that phone call from AJ, my son, letting me know of the diagnosis, listening to him as he sobbed on the phone. The initial jolt put us all in this really weird haze, not knowing how to process all this. The cancer initially seemed treatable, yet in our first level of grief was the fact that they were losing their chance to having a child naturally. After her first diagnosis, she had surgery and was declared cancer-free. That was good news. However, 8 months later, I was the one who again got the second call from AJ, letting me know that the cancer had returned and had moved throughout her body, and things did not look positive. So our family had lost others to death in the past, yet it was more emotionally acceptable based on really the long lives they had lived. We had not been given the book on how to deal with this kind of grief, where we lose someone we love who's so young. How we initially all processed, our relationship with God differed, and I'm sure for all of us, and I won't speak for AJ or Ben or Michaela or the rest of our family or our close friends, but I'm sure there were moments of intense despair. There's probably anger towards God. It is seemingly lack of intervention in the healing process. So, when Jesus cries out, my God, and speaks of feeling distant with him, I see him walking out, what we all felt during those tragic moments over 4 years ago. In reality, Jesus had partnered with us in our journey through his immense suffering. As I mentioned in Psalm 22, it starts with despair, but it moves towards trust. Obviously, Jesus, with little breath and strength, was not able to quote the entire psalm. If he had, embedded within the text is this phrase, quote, "For he has not despised or scorned the sufferings of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help." This seems to indicate connection rather than separation. Some have seen that Jesus may have been drawing to those listening the messianic message embedded within the passage. The 7 phrases that were spoken from Christ on the cross to bookend this psalm, beginning with my God, and then ending with a rendition of it is finished, which he mentions at the cross, and it's verbalized in this psalm, he has done it. The other Psalm 22 parallel moment was when Jesus asked forgiveness for those gambling for his garments. All this points to is that Jesus embraces the psalmist's processing of anger or angst during an incredibly dark period, then moving toward trust in the Creator. How about the New Testament? What might it say regarding sin, God, his Son, and separation? Probably one of the most intriguing statements from Jesus is found in John 16:32, where he speaks to his disciples and he assures them by saying, a time is coming and has in fact come when you will be scattered each to your own home. You will leave me all alone. Yet I am not alone, for my Father, he's with me. It doesn't sound like abandonment to me. Something I never had thought about was that of the 7 statements made by Jesus on the cross, 3 of them implied relationship. Starting with the phrase, my God, That statement, we see significance of the pronoun choice. It's my God. Both the psalmist and Jesus presupposed relationship. Jesus later asks his Father to forgive those gambling for his garments. Then he speaks to him again at the end to accept his spirit, where he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. This direct involvement in conversation speaks to both he and his Father sharing connection. If you've ever been ghosted by someone, you understand the sense of separation. To be ghosted is to have engaged in some form of communication with another person, yet to receive no response. The reason I bring this up is that Jesus is not going to speak directly to his Father if he sees an unresponsiveness in him, or as we might say today, has been ghosted by him. This just makes sense. Finally, if we understand the oneness of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, or as we know, the Trinity, the concept of separation of the Godhead is difficult to process theologically. So why is this all important? I believe, it's vital in how we see God. The subtle underlying message of a God who turned his back on Jesus at the cross can have some transference to those of us who've been abandoned physically or relationally in our lives. What situation, however ugly, will cause God to turn around and move away from me? Many of us have had issues of dependencies, whether drugs or alcohol, sexual perversion, binging of any kind. Needing a God who is not disgusted with us, who sides up with us, walks beside us as we journey in this darkness, however temporary or long, may later move toward us, toward a restored relationship. Knowing that he didn't abandon us during those moments of stupidity that we had. Remember the major premise of the paradigm of God turning his back on Jesus at the cross is that God's purity would not allow him to be in connection with Jesus, who now had become sin for us. But think about it. Again, Christ's life did not mirror this idea. He was known to be a friend of tax collectors and sinners. He ate and he drank with those who were unclean. He interacted, he engaged. So, as Abraham encouraged Isaac with the words, "Here I am," I believe the parallel is there between Jesus and his Father while he hung on the cross. Miller brings up, an interesting point that I've never really considered regarding the power of the crucifixion. The crucifixion is central to dealing with the issue of sin, obviously. Also, though, to be considered is that at the cross was the place where Jesus took up the lament of those in the throes of suffering and death. He's experiencing it as well as conquering it through his resurrection. The redemptive work of Christ while he walked on the earth involved engaging the sin issue as well as the human suffering issue. As we read in the Gospels, moments of expressions of forgiveness from Jesus were intricately connected to healing, where Jesus moves toward human pain and suffering. Psalm 22, according to the view of the Gospel writer, shows that Jesus died for the human hurt as well as the human sin. Thanks for listening to this pontification. I hope it stirs some conversation and thought regarding to how we process the narratives of God that we've embraced. Thanks again.